The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the city courthouse, casting a golden hue over the polished wooden benches and the ornate courtroom fixtures. Outside, a small crowd of reporters and curious onlookers had gathered, their cameras and notepads ready for what was expected to be a tense, high-profile trial. Inside, the room hummed with anticipation, a low murmur of whispered conversations and hurried footsteps echoing off the walls. Lawyers adjusted their ties and papers. Officers stood at attention, their hands resting casually on holsters, but their eyes alert. It was the kind of atmosphere that demanded seriousness, attention, and meticulous focus. Everyone in the room understood that this trial carried weight, and even a minor distraction could ripple through proceedings. Among the adults, however, a small figure sat quietly, a stark contrast to the tense energy that filled the room. 3-year-old Emma clutched a soft, well-loved stuffed bunny against her chest, her tiny legs dangling from the mother-sized chair beside her. Her dark curls framed her bright eyes, which seemed impossibly wide as she took in every detail of the courtroom. She had been told that they were here for an important, grown-up meeting, and though she didn't understand the full gravity of the trial, she sensed that it was different from her usual days at the park or daycare. There was an air of seriousness that made her instinctively sit very still, yet curiosity glimmered behind her lashes. Emma's mother, Claire, tried to keep her daughter occupied, whispering gently in her ear and offering little explanations that were suitable for a toddler's understanding. "See the people, Emma. They're talking about right and wrong. Watch quietly, honey," she said, brushing a stray curl behind Emma's ear. Claire was acutely aware of how unusual this trial was, not just because of its legal implications but because of the high security presence. Police officers stood near the entrances, some in uniforms, others in plain clothes, each one vigilant and seemingly weighing the seriousness of the day ahead. A few K-9 handlers were present too, preparing their dogs for demonstration later in the trial. It was one of these dogs who caught Emma's full attention. A large German shepherd sat beside its handler, perfectly poised, its muscular body tense yet controlled. Its coat gleamed under the morning light streaming through the windows, and its ears twitched occasionally as it scanned the room, fully aware of the gravity of its surroundings. Emma's little hand shot up instinctively, her finger pointing directly at the dog. "Doggy," she whispered softly to her mother, tugging at her sleeve in excitement. Claire glanced down and smiled gently, trying to keep her daughter calm. "Yes, sweetheart, that's the police dog. Be very quiet, okay?" she said, adjusting the bunny in Emma's lap. But Emma's fascination wasn't something that could be easily redirected. Her eyes followed the dog's every move, from the way its ears perked at each sound to the subtle way it shifted its weight slightly while sitting. There was something captivating about the dog's stillness and attentiveness, a quiet authority that Emma seemed to recognize instinctively. As the judge entered the courtroom, the murmurs subsided into a hushed silence. The gavel struck the wooden podium, its sound reverberating throughout the room. "Court is now in session," the judge announced, his voice firm but steady. Emma barely noticed. Her eyes remained glued to the German shepherd, who now lifted its head slightly and stared back at her, the connection brief but enough to deepen her fascination. The child's tiny hand stayed raised, pointing, as if to silently acknowledge the dog's presence and importance in the room. The trial began with the prosecutor presenting the first piece of evidence, a series of photographs documenting a theft ring that had terrorized several neighborhoods. The adults leaned in, whispering legal strategies and arguing points quietly. Claire held Emma on her lap, guiding her through the proceedings gently. "We're seeing pictures, honey. The grown-ups are talking about what happened," she whispered. Emma nodded seriously, though she only half understood. Her attention flitted between the papers and the dog, who remained an unwavering point of focus. There was a calm determination in her gaze, as if she had assigned herself the silent role of watching over the canine hero in the room. The police dog, named Rex, was an experienced K-9 officer, trained for search and rescue, narcotics detection, and public safety demonstrations. Though the adults saw him as part of the official proceedings, Emma saw him differently. In her small world, Rex wasn't a piece of law enforcement. He was a majestic figure, full of strength and quiet bravery. She leaned slightly forward, pointing again, her finger steady and unflinching. For Emma, this wasn't a courtroom. It was a stage, and Rex was the hero she had discovered. She whispered softly, "Good doggy," barely audible, yet the sincerity in her voice carried a warmth that contrasted sharply with the tense room. The handler, standing alert beside Rex, noticed the small child's gestures and offered a subtle nod, acknowledging her admiration. He had worked with many people in courtrooms before but had rarely seen such pure recognition from a toddler. Emma's fascination seemed to infuse the room with an unusual energy, a tiny disruption to the adult-focused tension that had filled the space since morning. Even the stenographer paused momentarily, glancing down at the child's pointing finger with a faint smile before resuming typing furiously. The jurors, initially focused on the case, began to steal glances at Emma. Her innocent curiosity and unwavering focus on Rex created an unexpected human moment amid legal seriousness. A few whispered comments passed quietly between them, not loud enough to interrupt the trial, but enough to break the oppressive tension that had hung like a heavy cloud. "That's a brave dog," one whispered. Another nodded, "and a fearless little girl." The contrast was striking. In a room filled with debates over crime, punishment, and evidence, the bond between a child and a dog was quietly commanding attention. As the morning progressed, Emma remained captivated. Every time a new lawyer approached the podium or a witness took the stand, her finger found its way back to Rex. The handler occasionally gave a reassuring pat on the dog's back, as if acknowledging the silent encouragement from the tiny spectator. Claire, seated carefully to avoid blocking Emma's view, felt a swelling sense of pride mixed with amusement. She realized that her daughter, entirely unconsciously, was bringing a sense of humanity and warmth into a room that otherwise thrived on tension and seriousness. The courtroom itself seemed to respond. Even the judge, a man known for his strict demeanor, allowed a faint smile to cross his face when he noticed Emma's pointing finger. It was as if the presence of innocence reminded everyone why their work mattered, not just as a system of rules and consequences, but as a safeguard for the very lives and moments that children like Emma represented. The child's fascination with Rex, a small but sincere gesture, had begun to ripple through the entire space. By late morning, the scene had subtly shifted. Lawyers maintained professionalism but occasionally glanced at Emma, some with softened expressions. Witnesses, aware of the child's presence, found themselves speaking with slightly more warmth. Even the officers, who had spent hours ensuring order and security, felt a moment of lightness, a gentle reminder that beyond the seriousness of law and crime, there existed moments of pure, unadulterated human connection. Emma, still pointing at Rex, seemed to sense something special. Though she didn't understand the intricacies of the trial, she understood admiration, courage, and loyalty, and she was expressing it with unwavering honesty. As the first part of the trial unfolded, it became clear that Emma's small action, pointing at a police dog, was more than mere curiosity. It was a quiet statement of recognition, a connection between innocence and heroism, a reminder that even in the most serious settings, moments of humanity and warmth could shine through. The room, once filled only with tension, had been subtly transformed by a 3-year-old girl who simply saw a dog and admired him with her whole heart. Little did anyone know, this small act would soon draw the attention of everyone in the courtroom and beyond, creating a story that would be remembered far longer than the trial itself. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm. Lawyers shuffled papers, witnesses shifted nervously in their seats, and the gavel echoed at regular intervals, marking each moment of official procedure. Yet amidst the formal atmosphere, Emma remained an unwavering observer. Her tiny hands rested atop her mother's lap, and her gaze never left the large German shepherd seated beside its handler. The dog, known as Rex, sat with impressive discipline, eyes flicking occasionally toward the courtroom doors. ears twitching at each sound, but always returning to its calm, watchful posture. To Emma, he wasn't a trained K-9 officer or a participant in an ongoing trial. He was a hero, worthy of her admiration. Claire watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and bemusement. She had expected Emma to squirm, to grow bored, or even to nap during the trial, but the 3-year-old had proven surprisingly patient. "You like him, don't you?" Claire whispered, brushing a loose curl from Emma's forehead. Emma nodded enthusiastically, her tiny finger pointing toward Rex once again. She leaned closer to her mother and whispered, "Good doggy." The soft voice, barely audible over the courtroom murmurs, seemed to bring a ripple of warmth through the otherwise tense environment. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor had begun to lay out a critical piece of evidence. Photographs of suspects, a timeline of stolen goods, and carefully documented witness statements were displayed on the large projector screen. The attorneys' voices were precise and measured, each word intended to sway the jury and establish the weight of the prosecution's case. The adults in the room were intensely focused on the legal arguments, yet Emma's attention remained steadfast. She was oblivious to the nuances of law or the complexities of the case. Her focus was singular, the dog sitting stoically at the front of the room. The courtroom's human occupants couldn't help but notice the small figure of Emma. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard, whispered to his neighbor, "Look at that little girl. She's completely fixated on the dog." His companion smiled and nodded. "It's kind of nice, isn't it? Reminds you there's more to life than these disputes." Even the stenographer glanced up for a split second. Fingers paused on the keyboard, captivated by the simplicity of a child's curiosity juxtaposed against the complexity of adult concerns. Rex, for his part, seemed to sense the silent connection. While trained to maintain focus, he occasionally flicked his gaze toward Emma as though acknowledging her presence. The handler, Officer Daniels, stood tall, clipboard in hand, and occasionally offered subtle reassurance with a pat to Rex's shoulder. He had worked with this dog for years, seen him rescue missing children, detect dangerous substances, and perform under the most stressful situations. Yet there was something about this toddler's admiration that even the seasoned officer had not anticipated. There was a purity in Emma's attention, a sincerity that transcended the formalities of law and procedure. As the prosecutor continued, Emma's finger occasionally shifted, tracing the outline of Rex's muscular frame. She whispered excitedly under her breath, attempting to get her mother's attention each time the dog shifted or twitched an ear. Claire chuckled softly, whispering back, "Yes, he's a very good dog, honey, just like you said." The softness of their exchange, unnoticed by most, introduced an element of warmth into the courtroom. It was a human moment, fragile and fleeting, yet profoundly grounding amidst the tension. The defense attorney, a composed woman with keen eyes, noticed Emma as well. During a brief pause in proceedings, she leaned over to her colleague and murmured, "See that little girl pointing at the dog? Something about her, it's, I don't know, disarming." Her colleague nodded subtly. Indeed, the sight of a child admiring an animal in such a serious environment seemed to break the usual rigidity. It reminded everyone present that beyond the legal arguments and the strategies lay a human world, one of innocence, loyalty, and admiration. A few rows back, some of the witnesses for the prosecution tried to stifle quiet smiles. A young man, nervous in front of the gallery, noticed Emma's small gestures and hesitated mid-sentence. The courtroom, which had been dominated by the seriousness of testimony and scrutiny of facts, suddenly seemed to breathe. Emma's finger remained pointed steadily at Rex, a tiny signal that something larger was unfolding, not through words, but through observation, recognition, and the raw honesty of a child's gaze. As the trial progressed, a short recess was called. Claire whispered to Emma, "Do you want to stretch your legs, honey?" Emma shook her head firmly. "Stay, watch doggy," she replied. The judge, observing the exchange from the bench, allowed the mother and daughter to remain seated. Though accustomed to courtroom protocol, he appreciated that a small display of human innocence could not only soften the mood but also remind everyone of what they were ultimately here to protect: families, communities, and everyday life. During this pause, Officer Daniels approached quietly, crouching slightly to meet Emma's eyes. "Hi there, little one," he said softly. Rex remained seated, tail barely moving, maintaining composure. "Do you like Rex?" the officer asked gently. Emma's eyes lit up and she nodded vigorously. "Good doggy, brave doggy," she exclaimed, a wide smile spreading across her face. The officer smiled, subtly impressed by her enthusiasm and unfiltered admiration. He patted Rex lightly, and the dog tilted his head as though responding to the praise. Claire whispered, "See, even he likes you." Emma giggled quietly, absorbed in her tiny moment of connection. The courtroom slowly resumed its activities. Witnesses returned, and lawyers continued their presentations, but Emma's unwavering focus on Rex remained. Every time a new argument was made, her finger instinctively found its way back to the dog. The jurors, although remaining impartial in their official capacity, could not ignore the subtle influence of her presence. It served as a quiet reminder that, beyond the dry procedures of law, there was room for humanity, for admiration, and for the recognition of courage, even in the form of a dog. By mid-morning, the subtle yet powerful effect of Emma's attention had begun to ripple through the courtroom. Lawyers occasionally glanced toward her, their expressions softening. Witnesses found themselves speaking with a touch more warmth, consciously or unconsciously influenced by the innocent observer. Even the court reporter found herself stealing glances, her fingers hovering over the stenotype keys, briefly captivated by the juxtaposition of childlike wonder and professional rigor. In every corner of the room, the dynamic had shifted, not drastically, but perceptibly. Emma's small actions, simple as they were, had created a shared experience that no one could ignore. Emma, for her part, remained entirely absorbed in Rex. She whispered little observations, pointing out his ears, his tail, and the way he looked at the people around him. Claire, watching her daughter, reflected on the unusual blend of innocence and impact. How strange and wonderful it was that a tiny, 3-year-old girl could subtly influence the attention and emotions of so many adults, all in one small courtroom. Emma's fascination was a gentle reminder that heroism was not only in grand actions, but also in recognition, silent, heartfelt, and honest. The courtroom continued to hum with activity, but now there was an underlying warmth. The sharp edges of legal arguments were softened by the presence of a child and a dog, a pairing that, through no intentional effort, reminded all present of the simple virtues of courage, loyalty, and admiration. Emma's finger remained pointed, unwavering, as she studied Rex's calm, noble demeanor. And as the judge called the next witness, everyone, lawyers, officers, jurors, and spectators alike, felt a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. A small observer, unnoticed at first, was now the heart of a room filled with serious, grown-up matters. By the time the morning session drew toward a brief pause, it was clear that Emma's presence had become more than a curiosity. She was a silent observer, a quiet commentator on the proceedings, her attention to Rex bringing out an unexpected humanity in everyone around her. Claire adjusted her daughter on her lap, holding her close, and whispered, "You're very brave watching quietly, Emma." The child simply nodded, her wide eyes still locked on the German shepherd, entirely focused on what mattered most to her. In the stillness between the judge's gavel and the resumption of the trial, it became evident. Emma's small gestures, her pointing, her whispered comments, her silent admiration, had begun to draw attention in ways that no legal argument, no piece of evidence could. They were subtle yet powerful. The courtroom had become a stage for more than law. It had become a place where innocence, courage, and recognition intersected. And at the center of it all, a 3-year-old girl sat quietly, observing, pointing, and reminding everyone of what truly mattered. The courtroom had grown quiet again, though a subtle buzz lingered in the air, a residue of the morning's exchanges. Lawyers shuffled papers, jurors leaned forward, and the stenographer's fingers tapped furiously across the keys. Emma remained seated on her mother's lap, her stuffed bunny held tightly, her eyes never leaving the German shepherd at the front of the room. It was as though she were guarding him with her tiny gaze, ensuring no detail went unnoticed. Claire watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and amusement, marveling at how focused the toddler had become amidst the serious proceedings of a high-profile trial. The prosecutor rose to present a new piece of evidence, a set of photographs depicting the aftermath of a burglary. Witnesses had described the events in painstaking detail, and the jury leaned in attentively. Yet Emma's attention was elsewhere. Her tiny finger shot up again, pointing firmly at Rex. This time it was more deliberate, more noticeable. "Doggy," she whispered softly, tugging at her mother's sleeve. Claire leaned down, trying to calm her. "Sweetheart, stay quiet," she murmured, brushing a curl from Emma's forehead. But the child was undeterred, her admiration for the canine hero overpowering any instruction to remain still. The judge, a tall man with a commanding presence and a reputation for strict courtroom decorum, glanced down from the bench. At first, he barely registered the little girl's gesture, absorbed in the ongoing testimony. But the more he observed, the more he noticed the unwavering focus of her finger and her intense gaze. There was something quietly magnetic about the way she looked at Rex, an unspoken acknowledgement of his bravery and presence. For a moment, the gavel's authority seemed softened by innocence, as if Emma's small action had created a pause in the rigid rhythm of legal procedure. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney caught sight of Emma pointing. A flicker of surprise passed across her face, followed by a subtle smile. She leaned toward her colleague, whispering, "Look at that little girl pointing at the dog. It's almost disarming, isn't it?" Her colleague nodded, barely suppressing a smile of agreement. In a room accustomed to stern faces, calculated gestures, and the weight of legal strategy, Emma's action was like a sudden breath of fresh air. It reminded everyone that even in a space defined by rules and evidence, there was room for humanity, curiosity, and admiration. The jurors were not immune to the scene unfolding before them. One woman, middle-aged with kind eyes, whispered to her neighbor, "She's completely focused on the dog. Isn't that sweet?" The man next to her nodded. "Yes, and somehow it makes the whole room feel less tense." Others glanced at Emma sporadically, noting how a child could command attention without uttering a single word of testimony. There was a strange power in her innocence, a subtle force that reminded everyone present that there were layers to courage, heroism, and observation that transcended age. Rex, for his part, remained statuesque. Trained for high-pressure situations, he had sat through countless scenarios, endured the scrutiny of strangers, and followed every command of his handler, Officer Daniels. Yet there was something in Emma's unwavering gaze that seemed to resonate with him. His ears flicked occasionally in acknowledgement, and he shifted slightly, tilting his head in a manner that suggested mutual recognition. The handler, watching the interaction carefully, allowed a quiet smile. Even after years of service, he had never witnessed a connection like this, silent, profound, and entirely unprompted by adults. The courtroom photographers, having already captured the morning's official proceedings, now shifted discreetly to frame the small girl and the majestic dog. A soft click of a camera echoed, unnoticed by most but not by Emma. She leaned slightly forward, whispering to her mother, "Doggy good." Claire chuckled quietly. "Yes, honey, very good," she murmured, keeping her voice low to avoid disrupting the trial. It was a simple exchange, yet the subtle intimacy highlighted the contrast between innocence and authority, softness and rigidity, admiration and duty. Witnesses waiting to testify glanced at Emma's pointing finger and Rex's calm demeanor. Some smiled quietly to themselves, softened by the scene. A young woman, nervous as she prepared to give her statement, felt her voice falter just a little less under the scrutiny of the courtroom. It was as if Emma's gesture had created an undercurrent of empathy, reminding everyone that law was not just about facts, evidence, or procedure, but also about human emotion, connection, and recognition of courage, whether displayed by people or by animals. The judge's eyes returned to the little girl, observing her quietly. He had always believed in the dignity of the courtroom and the decorum required for proceedings to maintain fairness. Yet now, he realized that this small observer was creating a rare and unspoken balance. Emma's presence reminded the court that seriousness and humanity could coexist. Her silent gesture, her unwavering attention, was both innocent and profoundly affecting. For just a moment, the tension of the trial lifted, replaced by a shared acknowledgement of something pure and simple, a child recognizing a hero. As the morning progressed, Emma's pointing gesture became more deliberate. She leaned slightly toward the dog, her lips parting in a quiet whisper, "Good doggy, brave doggy." Claire tried once more to redirect her, but she could not suppress a smile. Emma's fascination was now a quiet spectacle, one that was drawing attention from adults who were accustomed to ignoring anything outside the strict boundaries of legal decorum. The little girl had become an unintentional mediator of emotion. Her admiration, a bridge between the rigidity of law and the warmth of empathy. Officer Daniels, aware of the subtle influence the child had on the room, exchanged a glance with the judge. He crouched slightly beside Rex, murmuring softly, "It seems she likes you." The dog responded with a subtle shift of posture, a recognition of the connection. For the officer, it was a moment that humanized the courtroom in a way that legal arguments never could. Here was courage recognized without reward, attention given without expectation, a quiet acknowledgement of service and bravery, embodied in both a child and a dog. The gallery, filled with reporters and onlookers, began to take note. Phones were discreetly raised, cameras positioned to capture the quiet yet compelling scene. One journalist whispered to another, "This could make a great story, a child pointing at a police dog in a courtroom. People will love it." Her colleague nodded, eyes fixed on Emma's small hand and the dog's unwavering gaze. The scene was simple, yet profoundly engaging. It was human drama distilled into its most elemental form. Innocence meets heroism. The courtroom continued, the trial unfolding as planned, but the energy had shifted. Emma's pointing gestures were no longer just a child's curiosity. They were a focal point, a subtle narrative thread that wove through the proceedings. Witnesses spoke with slightly more warmth. Lawyers exchanged glances softened by the unexpected distraction, and even the jurors seemed lighter, occasionally glancing at the child and the dog instead of solely at the evidence. A room once dominated by tension and procedure had become a space where innocence could influence attention, subtly reminding everyone of the human stakes behind the legal battle. By midday, it was evident that Emma's small action was shaping the atmosphere. A 3-year-old girl, through nothing more than silent observation and simple admiration, had created a shared emotional experience. Her finger pointed steadily at Rex, the German shepherd sitting loyally beside Officer Daniels, while the courtroom responded in kind. Softer glances, quieter murmurs, and a subtle warmth in a space that had been cold and formal just hours before. Claire watched with awe, realizing that her daughter's small gesture had the power to draw the attention and even the empathy of every adult in the room. The trial would continue, and the adults would remain focused on evidence, witnesses, and arguments, but Emma's pointing finger had introduced a new narrative, a story of innocence, recognition, and silent heroism. It was a reminder that even in the most structured and serious environments, small gestures could resonate profoundly. And as the gavel struck again, signaling the next segment of testimony, Emma's eyes remained locked on Rex. In that quiet, unwavering gaze, a courtroom of adults had discovered a moment of shared humanity, all sparked by a 3-year-old girl and a heroic police dog. The courtroom had settled into the steady rhythm of trial proceedings, yet the earlier curiosity of a small girl pointing at a police dog lingered in the air like a gentle current beneath the tension. Emma sat quietly on her mother's lap, her little hand still raised in unwavering admiration of Rex, the German shepherd. The dog, for his part, remained calm, alert, and attentive, a seasoned officer in a human-dominated world, yet somehow aware of the silent acknowledgement from the tiny observer in the gallery. Claire, noticing how Emma's eyes followed Rex's every movement, whispered softly, "You like him, don't you, honey?" Emma nodded vigorously, her tiny fingers curling slightly as she pointed again. "Brave doggy," she murmured. The words were barely audible, but they carried a purity and sincerity that seemed to ripple outward, affecting the people around her more than anyone could have anticipated. In the midst of testimony, witnesses, and the measured cadence of legal argument, this small moment of recognition became a quiet but powerful thread weaving through the proceedings. The prosecutor continued with the case, presenting documents and photographs that detailed the theft ring's activities. But now, even in the midst of legal rigor, the adults in the courtroom were intermittently drawn to Emma and Rex. Jurors, who had been intensely focused on evaluating testimony, occasionally stole glances at the child. There was a subtle softness in their gaze, a humanizing pause that shifted the atmosphere. Even the stern judge seemed to notice, allowing a brief flicker of warmth to cross his otherwise disciplined expression. Officer Daniels, standing beside Rex, glanced down at the little girl. The years of training and countless high-stress situations had taught him to focus on procedure, to maintain discipline, and to treat every courtroom appearance with exacting seriousness. Yet there was something in Emma's gesture that transcended protocol. The dog, trained to sense emotion, seemed to recognize the admiration without command, tilting his head slightly as though acknowledging her presence. Daniels allowed a quiet, subtle smile, understanding that this interaction, though small, was quietly transforming the courtroom. Emma's fascination was innocent, but it was powerful. She leaned slightly forward, whispering, "Good doggy, brave doggy." Her voice, soft and sincere, contrasted sharply with the formal, measured tones of lawyers and witnesses. It was a simple, unpolished expression of appreciation, yet it conveyed more emotion than the most carefully constructed argument or testimonial evidence. Claire squeezed her daughter gently, heart swelling with pride and amusement, understanding that Emma was contributing something far more profound than anyone had anticipated. A reminder that courage and loyalty could be recognized without words, and that innocence could influence even the gravest settings. The courtroom photographers had noticed the child's focus. Cameras clicked discreetly, capturing the moment that would later ripple far beyond the walls of this courtroom. Journalists whispered among themselves, anticipating a story that juxtaposed the rigidity of legal proceedings with the purity of a child's admiration. "She's completely captivated by the dog," one whispered. "That's the story people want to see, innocence and heroism in the same frame." The others nodded, their attention momentarily diverted from the technicalities of the trial, understanding that sometimes the smallest gestures could carry the largest weight in narrative and emotional impact. Witnesses who had been nervous and cautious found themselves softened by the scene. One elderly woman, poised to describe a critical moment in the theft case, paused briefly to glance at Emma and Rex. She smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing. When she resumed speaking, her voice had a lighter, warmer tone, almost unconsciously influenced by the innocent admiration occurring just a few rows behind her. Other witnesses experienced similar subtle shifts, as the presence of the child and the dog served as an unspoken reminder of humanity behind the cold facts and evidence. The jurors were particularly affected. A middle-aged man who had been evaluating testimony with a critical eye now allowed a small smile to touch his face when Emma whispered her soft praises to Rex. Another juror leaned slightly toward her neighbor, whispering quietly, "It's amazing how something so simple can make the whole room feel more human." Her neighbor nodded in agreement, and for a few moments, the juror's evaluation of facts was tempered by a quiet awareness that courage and loyalty existed beyond legal definitions, manifesting in ways as simple as a child admiring a dog. The defense attorney, observing the scene, allowed a faint smile to cross her usually serious face. She exchanged a glance with her colleague, quietly acknowledging the child's influence on the mood of the courtroom. In a place where every word, movement, and expression is measured for strategic effect, Emma's gestures were unpredictable, sincere, and emotionally resonant. She had introduced a dynamic into the trial that no professional could have anticipated. Innocence disrupting tension, admiration humanizing seriousness, and attention drawing focus away from procedural rigidity toward the quiet heroism of a police dog. Meanwhile, Rex remained perfectly poised, embodying discipline, bravery, and calm. He had been trained to withstand scrutiny, ignore distractions, and focus solely on his duties. Yet there was a gentle recognition in the way he shifted his posture, subtle but perceptible. The child's attention was acknowledged silently, through the tilt of his head, the slight wag of a tail, and the calm strength that radiated from him. To Emma, it was clear. This was a dog worthy of admiration, brave in ways she instinctively understood. To the adults, it was a reminder that heroism sometimes exists without fanfare, observable even by the most innocent of eyes. Claire whispered to her daughter again, "He likes you noticing him, Emma." The little girl's eyes sparkled, and she leaned slightly closer to Rex, whispering again, "Brave doggy." The simplicity of the gesture resonated more deeply than anyone anticipated. It was a quiet moment of connection that transcended the serious proceedings of the courtroom. In a place defined by legal arguments and meticulous procedure, a child's admiration had begun to subtly transform the energy of the room. Even the judge, known for his strict adherence to decorum, allowed a faint acknowledgement of the moment to linger in his expression. He had presided over countless trials, seen countless human behaviors, yet something about Emma's simple recognition of Rex's presence reminded him why justice existed in the first place, not just to evaluate crime, but to protect communities, honor bravery, and uphold the principles that safeguard human life. In a subtle, almost imperceptible way, he allowed the humanity of the situation to shine through. By mid-morning, Emma's small gestures had become a focal point for many in the courtroom. Jurors occasionally exchanged quiet smiles. Witnesses spoke with a warmer tone. Lawyers, usually preoccupied with strategy, noticed her presence and softened their demeanor. Even the officers in attendance seemed momentarily touched by the child's admiration. A single pointing finger, a quiet whisper, and the attentive gaze of a child had begun to influence the mood of the entire courtroom. As the session progressed, Emma leaned slightly forward, her tiny voice breaking the silence for the briefest moment. "Good doggy, very brave." The words were simple, but the sincerity carried through the room like a soft undercurrent, touching everyone present. Officer Daniels crouched slightly, offering a reassuring pat to Rex, who responded with subtle acknowledgement. The courtroom, tense moments earlier, had been transformed, if only slightly, into a space where humanity, courage, and innocence intersected. By the time the judge called for a brief recess, it was clear that Emma's simple gestures had left an indelible impression. What had begun as curiosity had evolved into quiet recognition of heroism, a reminder to everyone present that even in the structured, rigid environment of a courtroom, innocence and admiration could inspire subtle but powerful human reactions. Claire adjusted her daughter on her lap, whispering, "You've been watching very carefully, honey." Emma nodded, her eyes still fixed on Rex, and in that quiet moment it became evident. Her attention had quietly reshaped the energy of the entire courtroom. The courtroom had quieted after the brief recess, the murmur of the crowd replaced by the rhythmic tapping of the stenographer's keys and the soft shuffle of papers across the polished floor. The trial had entered its middle phase, with witnesses recounting details of the theft ring and lawyers carefully laying out evidence. Yet in one corner of the room, the same small observer remained steadfast. Emma sat on her mother's lap, clutching her worn stuffed bunny, eyes wide and unblinking as they followed the German shepherd sitting loyally beside Officer Daniels. Her tiny hand, raised intermittently, pointed directly at Rex, silently communicating admiration and fascination. Claire tried to keep her daughter occupied, whispering softly, "Do you want to draw, honey? Or maybe hold my hand?" but Emma barely responded. Her focus was singular, unwavering. "Doggy," she whispered again, leaning slightly forward. The soft, earnest voice, though barely audible, seemed to echo subtly throughout the courtroom. Those who had grown accustomed to the tense proceedings, witnesses, jurors, and even some of the lawyers, noticed the tiny voice, the small gesture, and couldn't help but be drawn in. There was a purity to it, a sincerity that contrasted sharply with the rigid formality of the courtroom. The media present had been documenting the trial diligently. Photographers and journalists had been quietly taking notes and snapping pictures of the official proceedings, but now their attention began to shift subtly toward the child. The flash of a camera captured Emma's pointing finger, her tiny expression of awe, and the poised German shepherd beside his handler. Reporters whispered among themselves, noting how remarkable it was that a 3-year-old could command attention in such a formal and tense environment. "This could be the human interest story of the day," one murmured. "A child, a dog, it's impossible not to be captivated." Even the jurors, who had been instructed to focus solely on evidence, occasionally stole glances. A woman, middle-aged and softly spoken, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "She's just watching him, but it's like she understands something we don't." Her neighbor nodded quietly, adding, "It's amazing she's so tiny, yet she's changed the mood of this room." These whispered comments were subtle, almost imperceptible, but the energy in the courtroom had begun to shift. What was once a space of rigid focus and controlled tension now carried a trace of warmth and human connection. Rex, sensing the attention, remained composed. Years of training had prepared him for unpredictable environments, and yet there was something in the small girl's gaze that seemed to touch him differently. He tilted his head slightly, ears flicking, as if acknowledging her admiration. Officer Daniels, noticing the subtle connection, allowed himself a quiet smile. "She likes you," he murmured softly to the dog. The German shepherd responded with a subtle wag of the tail, calm and dignified, an unspoken exchange that spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. To Emma, the acknowledgement was simple and direct. To the adults around them, it was a reminder of loyalty, discipline, and courage embodied in an unassuming form. As proceedings continued, the cameras discreetly captured Emma's fascination. One photo in particular, a tiny hand pointing, wide eyes fixed on a disciplined German shepherd, would later become iconic. The image had a quiet elegance, innocence and admiration juxtaposed against a backdrop of solemn proceedings. Reporters began taking notes, not just on the legal aspects of the case, but on the interaction unfolding in the corner of the courtroom. They observed how the child's presence affected the jurors, softened witnesses, and even seemed to lighten the usually serious expressions of the attorneys. It was a story waiting to be told, a subtle but powerful narrative that transcended the trial itself. The prosecutor paused briefly as a witness recounted a particularly harrowing moment of the theft investigation. Eyes flicked toward Emma and Rex, where the German shepherd remained calm and the child continued her quiet observation. The juxtaposition was striking. In one part of the room, adults detailed crime and evidence with clinical precision. In another, a child silently admired an animal whose courage and service had made him a hero in his own right. The contrast softened the courtroom, bridging the gap between the gravity of law and the warmth of human emotion. Outside the courtroom, reporters began preparing their stories. Social media accounts connected to major news outlets picked up snippets of the moment. The photograph taken earlier circulated internally, described as "a toddler honors police dog in courtroom." Soon, the story spread across various channels, the human interest narrative capturing hearts far beyond the courthouse walls. Journalists wrote about the child's unfiltered admiration, Rex's disciplined heroism, and the quiet humanity that had infiltrated an otherwise rigid and formal environment. The story of a 3-year-old girl and a police dog began to resonate nationwide, highlighting themes of courage, innocence, and recognition. Back inside, the courtroom remained professional, yet the subtle impact of Emma's gesture persisted. Witnesses, speaking under oath, occasionally stole glances at the small girl who had captivated them without intending to. Lawyers, while maintaining their focus on the trial, exchanged quiet looks acknowledging the unusual presence. Even the judge, noted for his strict adherence to procedural formality, allowed a brief moment of warmth, a slight shift in expression acknowledging the quiet influence of innocence and recognition in his courtroom. The child, entirely unaware of her growing fame beyond the courthouse, continued pointing at Rex, whispering softly, "Good doggy, brave doggy." Claire squeezed her daughter's hand, whispering a quiet reassurance. "You're very brave watching quietly, honey. That's a good girl." Emma smiled faintly, completely absorbed in the scene before her, oblivious to the ripple her gestures were creating far beyond the courtroom doors. Her attention, sincere and unwavering, had introduced a subtle yet profound energy to the proceedings, a reminder of humanity in the midst of legal rigor. Officer Daniels, observing the media's growing interest, allowed a quiet chuckle. He patted Rex's side, who sat still as a statue, unwavering in discipline but perceptibly proud. Years of service, countless demonstrations of bravery, and numerous missions had brought him to this moment, and yet the admiration of a tiny child in the courtroom seemed to give him a quiet sense of recognition, unmatched by medals or formal accolades. It was a moment of pure connection, silent and yet profoundly impactful. As the morning session neared its close, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. What began as a procedural trial dominated by tense exchanges and serious testimony had become a space of quiet warmth, where the innocence of a child and the steadfast courage of a police dog created a narrative far more engaging than any legal argument. Emma's pointing gestures, soft whispers, and unwavering gaze had begun to ripple through the room, influencing jurors, witnesses, attorneys, and even the judge. By the time the recess was called, Emma remained captivated by Rex, whispering her small praises, while the adults around her absorbed the understated transformation. Outside, reporters and photographers prepared to capture the story for the public. Cameras clicked, notes were taken, and social media editors quickly drafted posts highlighting the scene. Within hours, the story of a toddler honoring a police dog in the midst of a tense courtroom trial began to spread, touching hearts far beyond the city courthouse. It was remarkable and almost surreal. A single pointing finger and a soft whisper from a 3-year-old had created a ripple of attention, admiration, and human connection. The trial would continue, the legal arguments would proceed, but the story of Emma and Rex, the innocent observer and the loyal dog, would become a narrative that transcended the courtroom. In the midst of crime, evidence, and tension, a child's fascination had introduced warmth, humanity, and a reminder that heroism, no matter how disciplined or quiet, deserved recognition. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long, golden shadows across the polished wooden floor. The trial had resumed, but the energy in the room had shifted since the morning. Where once tension had dominated, a subtle warmth now lingered, carried by the quiet gestures of a tiny observer. Emma sat perched on her mother's lap, her stuffed bunny clutched tightly to her chest, eyes wide and unwavering as they followed Rex, the German shepherd seated beside Officer Daniels. Her little finger rose again, pointing steadily, accompanied by soft, sincere whispers. "Good doggy, brave doggy," she murmured, barely audible over the low hum of the courtroom. Claire glanced down at her daughter, a mix of pride and amusement in her eyes. "You're very observant, Emma," she whispered, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. Emma responded with a small nod, eyes never leaving Rex. The focus was intense, almost magnetic, drawing the attention of those around her. Witnesses paused mid-testimony, jurors stole glances, and even some of the lawyers allowed themselves a momentary distraction to observe the tiny girl and the heroic canine at the front of the room. The energy had subtly shifted, as if Emma's fascination had breathed life into the otherwise rigid proceedings. Rex, for his part, remained perfectly composed, embodying the discipline and dignity expected of a seasoned K-9 officer. Years of training had taught him to remain calm under scrutiny, to ignore distractions, and to respond to his handler's cues with precision. Yet there was an undeniable awareness in his posture, a gentle acknowledgement of the admiration from the tiny observer in the courtroom. Officer Daniels, nodding the subtle tilt of the dog's head toward Emma, allowed a small smile. The connection was quiet but profound, a silent recognition bridging innocence and heroism. The witnesses, too, were subtly affected. A middle-aged man who had been nervously recounting events of the theft ring paused briefly, stealing a glance at Emma's pointed finger and Rex's poised presence. A faint smile tugged at his lips, and when he resumed speaking, his voice carried a slight warmth that hadn't been present earlier. Another witness, a young woman, took a deep breath and adjusted her posture before continuing her statement, her hands trembling slightly less than before. Emma's quiet gestures had introduced a subtle, humanizing influence into the courtroom, an effect that none of the professionals had anticipated. The jurors were equally affected. One woman, taking meticulous notes, found herself smiling softly whenever she noticed Emma's gestures. Her neighbor, a man who had been observing every detail of testimony with intense focus, whispered quietly, "It's amazing, the child's attention, it's like it changes the energy here." The juror nodded in agreement. In a room dominated by legal arguments, procedural motions, and carefully controlled decorum, the presence of a small child admiring a police dog had introduced a shared emotional undercurrent, a quiet reminder that the trial was not only about facts and evidence, but about people, bravery, and connection. Meanwhile, the media present quietly documented the scene. Photographers adjusted their cameras, reporters jotted down notes, and a few editors whispered excitedly about how this story could resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. The photograph of Emma pointing at Rex, captured earlier, had begun circulating among social media teams and news desks. Headlines formed in the minds of journalists: "Toddler honors police dog in courtroom," or "Brave dog recognized by young observer during trial." It was a human interest narrative that contrasted sharply with the legal seriousness of the case, a reminder that sometimes the simplest gestures carried the deepest emotional weight. The prosecutor, returning to address the jury, noticed the subtle distractions caused by Emma's admiration. For a moment, he paused mid-sentence, realizing that the courtroom had collectively been affected by a child's recognition of bravery. He allowed a faint smile to touch his face, briefly acknowledging that not all influence in the room came from legal argumentation. The trial continued, but now with an added layer of humanity woven into the proceedings. Claire whispered quietly to Emma, "See, everyone is noticing him just like you do." Emma tilted her head slightly, eyes bright with understanding, though in her simple way she only cared that Rex had been seen and recognized. She whispered softly, "Brave doggy." The repetition carried weight, not because of the words themselves, but because of the sincerity behind them. The innocence and honesty of a 3-year-old could convey admiration more powerfully than hours of testimony or dozens of photographs. Officer Daniels, aware of the growing attention, subtly adjusted Rex's position, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "You're doing great," he murmured. Rex, calm and steady, seemed to respond to the gesture in his own quiet way. In the courtroom, the dog's presence became more than just a requirement of procedure. It was a symbol of discipline, bravery, and public service. And for Emma, it was a living, breathing hero, someone to admire and acknowledge without any need for explanation or ceremony. The witnesses continued their testimony, but now their words carried a new resonance. Descriptions of bravery, quick thinking, and moments of risk began to echo differently in the room. Every adult present was subconsciously reminded of courage, of the quiet acts that went unseen in everyday life. Emma's pointing finger and soft whispers transformed into a gentle heartbeat beneath the procedural rhythm of the trial, reminding all that heroism was not abstract. It could be observed, admired, and appreciated, even by the smallest member of society. The judge, presiding with his usual formality, allowed a slight moment of pause. His gaze lingered briefly on the child and the dog, and he seemed to consider the subtle influence they had on the courtroom atmosphere. Decorum remained intact, but a quiet acknowledgement passed through the room. Innocence and bravery in unexpected forms had entered the proceedings. The gavel struck again, and the trial moved forward, but the human element introduced by a tiny observer and a steadfast canine had permanently changed the tenor of the room. Outside the courtroom, news of Emma's attention to Rex had begun to spread. The social media posts shared by reporters highlighted the juxtaposition of a serious trial with a child's innocent admiration for a heroic dog. The story began to reach a wider audience, resonating far beyond local boundaries. People were captivated not by the legal drama but by the emotional narrative. A toddler's recognition of loyalty, bravery, and service in a dog, whose training and discipline exemplified these very qualities. Back inside, Emma remained absorbed. Her gaze shifted slightly as Rex adjusted his stance, a subtle acknowledgement passing between the two. She whispered softly, "Good doggy, very brave," each word carrying weight far beyond her years. Claire held her daughter's hand, smiling quietly, marveling at how a small child could influence not only those present in the courtroom, but also the broader public who would soon learn of this moment. By the end of the afternoon session, it was evident that the courtroom had been transformed by the simplest gestures of recognition. Emma's pointing finger, her whispered admiration, and the steady presence of Rex had created a narrative that no one could ignore. Jurors, witnesses, lawyers, officers, and reporters alike had been subtly affected, reminded of the human dimension behind the law and the quiet heroism that sometimes went unnoticed. A child had introduced humanity into a space dominated by structure, evidence, and procedure, and the ripples of her actions were only beginning to reach beyond the courthouse walls. As the gavel called the session to a brief recess, Emma remained focused on Rex. Her whispered words of admiration, her steady gaze, and her tiny hand pointing directly at the heroic dog had captured something far more enduring than any photograph or headline could convey. The recognition of courage and loyalty through the eyes of innocence, a reminder that the simplest acts of acknowledgement can resonate far deeper than anyone anticipates. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom had become a space where law, courage, and human connection intertwined in an unexpected way. The trial had resumed with witnesses and attorneys presenting evidence, yet no one could deny the subtle but growing influence of a tiny observer. Emma, perched on her mother's lap, continued her unwavering gaze on Rex, the German shepherd whose calm presence seemed to anchor the proceedings. Her small hand rose repeatedly, pointing firmly at the dog, and her soft whispers, "Good doggy, brave doggy," carried a weight that resonated far beyond her years. Claire watched her daughter with a mixture of awe and concern. She knew Emma was absorbing the environment in ways adults could barely comprehend. "Honey," she whispered, "try to stay quiet for just a little while longer." Emma barely responded, so absorbed was she in Rex's poised and disciplined presence. Her fascination was simple, yet powerful, a tiny human spotlight shining on an animal hero who had spent years serving the community without fanfare. Across the room, Officer Daniels observed the interaction with a quiet pride. He had trained Rex for years, preparing him for the most challenging scenarios, from apprehending dangerous suspects to locating missing children. But the admiration of a 3-year-old in a courtroom, pure, unprompted, and sincere, was something entirely new. He leaned slightly toward Rex and murmured, "She really likes you." The dog, as if understanding, lifted his head slightly and adjusted his posture, his tail giving a subtle, dignified wag. The acknowledgement between dog and child was silent, yet profound, and those who noticed could feel its quiet gravity. The jurors, too, were becoming increasingly aware of Emma's gestures. Previously focused solely on testimony and evidence, many now allowed brief glances toward the corner where the child's attention remained steadfast. One juror, a middle-aged man with glasses, whispered quietly to his neighbor, "It's incredible, a child noticing him like that. Makes you think about the courage behind his work, doesn't it?" The neighbor nodded, quietly smiling. It was a subtle, shared human moment that reminded everyone in the courtroom of the stakes beyond paperwork and procedural arguments. Meanwhile, the media presence had intensified. Photographers, journalists, and editors recognized the story's human interest potential. By now, photos of Emma pointing at Rex, her eyes wide with admiration, had circulated through news agencies, and snippets of the narrative were being drafted for social media, television, and online publications. The story was simple but captivating. A toddler, captivated by a heroic police dog during a serious courtroom trial, highlighting the unspoken virtues of loyalty, bravery, and recognition. Outside the courtroom, tweets and posts began spreading rapidly. Headlines such as "3-year-old honors police dog in courtroom," and "Innocence meets heroism," "Toddler points out police dog" circulated, garnering attention from viewers nationwide. People were drawn to the emotional narrative, contrasting the innocence of a child with the bravery and service of a disciplined K-9. Within hours, the story had reached local and national outlets, capturing the hearts of readers who marveled at how a small gesture could hold so much weight. Back inside the courthouse, the effect of this growing attention was subtly felt. Witnesses, speaking under oath, seemed more at ease, softened by the presence of the child and the heroic dog. Lawyers, though maintaining professional composure, occasionally glanced toward Emma, their expressions touched by the sincerity of her gestures. Even the judge, presiding with his usual formality, allowed a faint acknowledgement to cross his face, a reminder that law, procedure, and evidence coexisted with human empathy and admiration. Emma, blissfully unaware of the ripple her actions had caused outside the courtroom, continued pointing. Her soft voice rose intermittently, "Good doggy, brave doggy." Each utterance was pure, heartfelt, and simple, yet it carried an energy that affected everyone who noticed. Claire squeezed her daughter's hand gently, whispering, "You're doing very well, honey." Emma smiled faintly, her attention unwavering. For her, the world had narrowed to a single, heroic presence, a dog whose courage deserved recognition. Officer Daniels noticed that Rex seemed unusually aware of the energy in the room. Though trained to remain focused on his duties, there was a subtle acknowledgement in his gaze directed at Emma. The German Shepherd, a silent embodiment of bravery and discipline, became more than a participant in a legal procedure. He had transformed into a figure of admiration, bridging the gap between innocence and experience, between law and humanity. Each time Emma pointed and whispered, it was as if she were communicating gratitude that transcended words. The courtroom gallery, initially tense and silent, now hummed with quiet engagement. Spectators leaned slightly forward in their seats, catching glimpses of Emma's small finger tracing Rex's form. Witnesses, attorneys, and jurors alike began to notice the effect, acknowledging that the innocence of a child could carry more weight than hours of legal argument. The simple admiration of a toddler highlighted the courage of a dog who had performed countless heroic acts often overlooked by the public, but now receiving recognition through the pure eyes of a 3-year-old. The national attention continued to build. A news anchor, reporting live from outside the courthouse, described the scene with fascination. In a courtroom filled with legal tension, a 3-year-old girl's admiration for a police dog has captured the hearts of witnesses, jurors, and viewers nationwide. Her pointing finger and whispered praise remind us that courage is often recognized in the smallest, simplest ways. Across the country, people were drawn to the story, commenting on social media about how moving it was to witness innocence honoring heroism. Inside, the courtroom's energy subtly shifted. Lawyers adjusted their tones, witnesses spoke with gentler cadence, and jurors occasionally exchanged quiet smiles. Even the judge, observing the dynamics of human emotion intertwined with legal process, allowed a subtle relaxation in his expression. Emma's simple gestures had achieved something remarkable. They had humanized the proceedings, reminding everyone that bravery could be observed, appreciated, and honored, even without formal acknowledgement or ceremony. Claire glanced down at her daughter, a mixture of pride and humility in her expression. "You're very brave noticing him, honey," she whispered. Emma tilted her head slightly, her wide eyes filled with understanding, as though acknowledging the importance of recognizing courage whenever and wherever it appeared. The simplicity of her admiration had transformed a tense, procedural courtroom into a space where human connection, respect, and recognition prevailed alongside law and evidence. As the session continued, Emma's pointing gestures remained steady, and her whispers occasional but heartfelt. Each word she uttered, soft, unassuming, and honest, reverberated subtly throughout the room. The effect on witnesses, jurors, and legal professionals was unmistakable. In a courtroom typically defined by formalities, precision, and tension, a small child's admiration had created a shared human moment, highlighting the often overlooked value of courage, service, and innocence. By late afternoon, it was clear that the story of Emma and Rex had moved beyond the courthouse. National news coverage amplified the emotional resonance of the scene, emphasizing that heroism could be recognized in the simplest gestures, and that innocence could command attention more effectively than any legal argument. The photograph of Emma pointing, her eyes wide with awe, and the German shepherd poised beside Officer Daniels had become iconic, an image that would be remembered long after the trial concluded. As the gavel finally called a brief recess, Emma remained focused, her small hand still pointing toward Rex. Her whispers, barely audible, carried sincerity and warmth, leaving an impression that would linger long after the legal proceedings ended. The courtroom, once a space dominated by procedure and tension, had been subtly transformed by the attention of a small child and the quiet dignity of a police dog. Across the country, viewers marveled at the simplicity and purity of the moment, captivated by the unspoken bond between a toddler and a heroic animal. The courtroom was quiet, filled with an expectant hush. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the high windows, illuminating the polished floors, the wooden benches, and the figures of those gathered to witness the trial's proceedings. Emma sat on her mother's lap, clutching her worn stuffed bunny tightly, her tiny hand once again pointing at Rex, the German shepherd who had become the unspoken hero of the day. Her soft whispers, "Good doggy, brave doggy," were almost drowned in the formality of the courtroom, yet their sincerity carried a weight that resonated far beyond the room's walls. Claire glanced down at her daughter, marveling at the unwavering focus. "You've been watching him all day," she whispered, brushing Emma's hair from her forehead. Emma's eyes remained fixed on Rex, her admiration unwavering. She leaned slightly forward, her fingers still extended, as if to ensure that the dog knew she understood his bravery. "Brave doggy," she murmured again, her small voice carrying across the room. It was a simple statement, yet its purity and honesty made everyone who heard it pause and reflect. Officer Daniels observed quietly, his own pride evident but tempered by the solemnity of the trial. Years of service, countless dangerous missions, and endless hours of training had prepared him for moments of stress, scrutiny, and ceremony. Yet none of those experiences compared to this. A tiny child, wholly unaware of the legal proceedings, had recognized something essential about Rex, something that even adults, absorbed in paperwork and procedure, could sometimes forget. The dog, sitting poised and alert, seemed to understand the significance of Emma's admiration. A subtle wag of the tail, a slight tilt of the head, conveyed acknowledgement, mutual respect, and quiet pride. The judge, presiding over the trial with his usual composure, allowed a faint smile to touch his face. He had observed countless cases, presided over tense arguments, and endured procedural challenges, yet the interaction unfolding before him was unlike anything he had witnessed. A 3-year-old's recognition of a police dog's bravery had subtly transformed the room, softening the energy, humanizing the proceedings, and reminding everyone present of the real-world stakes behind the legal evidence. For a moment, even the gavel seemed less like an instrument of authority and more like a witness to humanity in its simplest, purest form. The prosecutor, preparing to question the next witness, found his focus momentarily pulled by Emma's persistent admiration. The small gestures, the pointing finger, the whispered praise, the unwavering gaze, were disarming, reminding him that courage and recognition often existed beyond the confines of legal argumentation. He paused for a brief moment, letting the humanity of the scene sink in, and then continued, now with a subtle warmth influencing his tone. Witnesses, lawyers, and jurors all felt it too. The courtroom, though still a place of law and procedure, had been touched by innocence and bravery in ways no one could have anticipated. Emma's attention had already captured the notice of journalists and photographers. Social media posts highlighting the child pointing at Rex had gone viral, attracting viewers from across the country. Headlines proclaimed, "Toddler honors police dog in courtroom," and "A child reminds us what true bravery looks like." But for Emma, none of this mattered. Her world had narrowed to the dog at the front of the room, whose calm demeanor and heroic service had earned her unfiltered admiration. The simplicity of her attention, the honesty of her recognition, was more than enough. The judge called the next witness forward, a local officer who had worked alongside Rex in several high-risk operations. The man, usually reserved and precise in his speech, seemed softer today, perhaps influenced by the presence of a small child so completely absorbed in observing the dog. "Rex," the officer began, "has been part of multiple critical missions. He has located missing persons, apprehended suspects, and provided invaluable support to our community." As he spoke, his gaze occasionally shifted to Emma, still pointing unwaveringly at the German shepherd. Her presence seemed to amplify the importance of every word he said, infusing the testimony with quiet emotional weight that resonated with jurors, lawyers, and spectators alike. Emma leaned slightly forward, whispering again, "Good doggy, brave doggy." The words, simple and pure, carried through the room like a gentle echo, reminding everyone that courage could be recognized without ceremony, that admiration could be expressed without fanfare, and that innocence often saw truths adults overlooked. Officer Daniels crouched slightly beside Rex, murmuring, "She really understands you, doesn't she?" The dog responded with a subtle nod of the head, calm yet dignified, acknowledging the bond forming in a way that transcended words. The jurors, deeply engaged in the proceedings, were now fully aware of the dynamic between the child and the dog. One juror whispered softly to her neighbor, "It's incredible the way she recognizes him. Makes you appreciate what he does even more." Her neighbor nodded, eyes glistening slightly, and for a brief moment the tension of the trial was replaced by shared human appreciation. Emma's gestures, once small and nearly unnoticed, had become the thread connecting courage, innocence, and recognition throughout the room. Outside, the story continued to spread. News outlets broadcasted footage of Emma pointing at Rex, highlighting the unexpected human interest element of the courtroom drama. Viewers were captivated by the image of a tiny child acknowledging the quiet heroism of a police dog, demonstrating that admiration and courage could intersect in the simplest, most sincere ways. Social media commentary poured in, with thousands of people praising both the child and the dog, emphasizing how rare it was to witness such an unfiltered, heartfelt connection. Back inside, the trial neared its conclusion. Emma, still focused on Rex, whispered once more, "Brave doggy." Her words, innocent and unadorned, carried a profound truth. Courage deserved recognition, and bravery, no matter how disciplined or quiet, could inspire admiration in ways adults sometimes overlooked. Claire gently squeezed her daughter's hand, whispering, "You're very good noticing him, honey. He's brave, just like you said." Emma smiled faintly, satisfied that her small acknowledgement had been made, oblivious to the fact that her actions had captured the hearts of people far beyond the courtroom. The judge, recognizing the unique energy in the room, allowed a brief acknowledgement. "It is evident," he said softly, "that acts of bravery, whether by humans or animals, deserve recognition. Even in a courtroom, we are reminded that courage can be observed and honored by anyone, regardless of age." The statement, unusual yet fitting, resonated deeply. It validated the quiet influence of Emma's attention, the dignity of Rex's service, and the humanity present in every person who had been touched by the simple, sincere gestures of a child. As the gavel signaled the end of the trial day, Emma remained focused on Rex, whispering one last, "Good doggy, brave doggy." The courtroom rose slowly, jurors and spectators alike casting one final glance at the tiny child and the heroic German shepherd. Photographers captured the scene, preserving the quiet intimacy between innocence and heroism. Officer Daniels gave Rex a subtle pat, acknowledging both the dog's discipline and the unique connection forged with the child. Claire held Emma close, marveling at the profound impact her daughter had had on everyone in the room. Outside, news reports highlighted the extraordinary courtroom moment. Headlines proclaimed Emma as the child who reminded a nation of courage and admiration. Rex became recognized not only as a police dog, but as a symbol of silent bravery and loyal service. Social media erupted with praise for both the toddler and the dog, with viewers commenting on the rare beauty of innocence, recognizing courage in its purest form. By evening, the story had reached hearts across the country. Emma, unaware of the widespread attention, simply felt content knowing she had acknowledged a brave dog. Claire smiled, reflecting on the day. A courtroom had been transformed by innocence, admiration, and recognition, showing that even the smallest gestures could leave a lasting impact. Rex, stoic yet proud, remained a hero in both professional and deeply human terms. And for everyone who had witnessed or later heard the story, the lesson was clear. Courage, discipline, and bravery could inspire admiration, and sometimes it took the unfiltered eyes of a child to remind the world of that truth. In the quiet after the trial, the courthouse felt lighter, warmer, and more human. Emma's pointing finger and whispered praises had created ripples far beyond the walls of the courtroom, touching hearts, inspiring admiration, and reminding everyone of the extraordinary bond that can exist between innocence and heroism. And in that shared moment, both child and dog left a legacy of recognition, courage, and warmth that would not soon be forgotten.